I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 219th episode of this podcast dedicated to showing you nooks, corners, and crannies of your own brain that you might not have even been aware of. Because believe it or not, we are still learning new things about the brain, and more to the point today, the contents of consciousness that until recently we really had no clue about. Today we are going to be talking about a recently coined term, and more importantly, what that term represents. Something that's called aphantasia, which might affect a surprisingly large percentage of the population. You might be aphantasic and not know it. It is an attribute, but a particularly well-hidden one because it's an attribute that really only shows itself inside a person's imagination. We will get into all the aphantasia nitty-gritty in the main interview talking with Dr. Joel Pearson, who's one of the lead researchers now looking at this attribute. If you hang around until the very end of this episode, I'm going to tell you about a new test that has been devised that might be able to give a heads up on the development of Alzheimer's some 20 to 30 years before symptoms first appear and at a price that beats anything that's currently on the market. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, but for right now, let's kick things off, as usual, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So if you've been watching any of the Winter Olympics, you've been seeing amazing figure skating stuff going on, people jumping triple axels and spinning in circles so impossibly fast, it seems like any normal person would double over and vomit immediately afterwards. Obviously, these are people working at the absolute highest skill levels attainable, but it still raises the question of how in the heck do they make their bodies do these things, and to what extent is the brain involved? As we know, there's no such thing as muscle memory. It's really all brain memory. But one of the interesting things in looking at figure skaters is a lot of what they've learned isn't just to make their bodies do things, but to make their bodies not do certain things that would be very standard things for a body to do when it's been trained to live as an adult human being on planet Earth, reflexive behaviors that they need to shut off and not allow to interfere with their performance when they're out on the ice. In many ways, these amazing performances are just as much about suppressing actions as initiating them. Take, for example, tilting backwards. You could try this if you're sitting in a chair right now. See how far you can tilt your chair back before, almost by sheer reflex, you grab the table in front of you and pull yourself forward. Your stomach clenches up and you double forward and try to reestablish your equilibrium with your head upright. What's happening here is that the nerve cells in your inner ear are sending messages to the brainstem, from the brainstem out to the spinal cord and finally to the body's muscles to try to execute the move to save yourself from tipping. But in some figure skating moves, the skaters want to remain basically hanging horizontally for long periods of time, fully extended, not letting that reflex kick in. And according to researchers studying sports athletics, practice can lead to new mappings of neurons in the brain's cerebellum to actually fire out signals suppressing the brain's normal reflexes. It's not that the reflexes are turned off, it's that countermanding orders go out at the same time, essentially telling the muscles not to freak out, that this is all going to be okay. And those messages can get through loud and clear because they've been practiced so many thousands or tens of thousands of times over the course of the Olympic athlete's training career. In addition to suppressing physical reflexes, skaters' brains are also experts at avoiding dizziness. Normally, as we're moving through the world, our eyes are automatically compensating for the small head movements that we're making. We and other animals are actually amazingly good at this. We can watch a moving object moving through a landscape that we ourselves are moving through. And as long as distractions are within acceptable parameters, you're not walking through a cyclone or something, you can probably do a pretty good job. This works pretty well as long as our movements are not too repetitive. The moment that they start to get predictable, our brain starts trying to cheat a little bit and move a couple steps ahead, thinking that it's doing us a favor, setting up some compensating mechanisms for whatever it is that we've been repetitively doing. That whole effect when you spin in a circle for a while, then stop spinning and it feels like the room's spinning around you, that's an example of this. Another one close to home for me, in fact, I'm standing on it now. I've got a treadmill desk that slides under my normal standing desk, and so I'm not doing it now because you could hear it on the microphone, but oftentimes I'll just be standing at my computer walking at a constant speed for a long time, and of course the room's not moving around me, and my brain starts to compensate for that by making it feel like the room is sliding away from me at the same speed that I'm walking. So then when I turn the track off, all of a sudden there's the perceptual illusion that the whole room is sliding towards me, though I'm standing still, which is quite weird. Needless to say, illusions like this are meant to help you out, and as long as things keep going the way that your brain predicts, they actually are helpful. But part of the job description of an Olympic skater is to be able to spin in incredibly fast circles and then stop on a dime and all of a sudden be going in a straight line. And so they have to develop as part of their training the ability to shut off that reflexive dizziness that most of us would feel. Again, this seems to happen because of suppressive mechanisms that are built up within the brain's cerebellum. But amazing to think that these Olympic skaters, when they're going in an incredibly tight, fast circle that would leave most of us seeing spinning smears when we came out of it, their vision is able to quickly correct itself, get back to normal, and off they go.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Seacliff4 from the USA says, "The range of topics is broad. The interviewees are credible experts in their fields who are generally careful to distinguish between verified facts and hypotheses. I am a healthcare professional with 2 doctorates, and I always learn something useful from this podcast." And listener Lean Webstart from Canada says, "I don't know what Jesse puts in this podcast, but I think I'm addicted to it. Great information and great guests." Well, thank you, Seacliff. Thank you, Lean Webstart. And thanks to everybody that's left reviews on iTunes or elsewhere. Put out a Brain Breakfast newsletter this past week, which was surprisingly popular despite the topic being getting kicked in the groin. Apparently, I am not alone in being interested in the neuroscience of groin kicks. That is the kind of thing that you will get if you are a Brain Breakfast subscriber. The Brain Breakfast, of course, being our highly randomly timed newsletter, the one that continually defies my ability to accurately schedule. But despite that you can't set your clock by it, it does have certain other redeeming qualities. If you would like to try out the Brain Breakfast, you can get signed up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Over at Vitamunk.com, they're making things difficult for me by giving me a promotion that defies being put into a nice tight acronym. You've probably heard the term BOGO, buy one, get one. They're actually doing a buy one, get 2 promotion, so I guess that would be BOG2, but doesn't have quite the same ring despite being a better deal, obviously. This one actually takes place as part of their Amazon sales rather than their web sales. They've got Vitamunk.com, of course, but they also sell on Amazon. It is wickedly convenient over there, as you probably know. This BOG2 offer is going to be applicable to quite a few things on the Vitamunk shelf. Lots and lots of supplements over there, from alpha GPC to resveratrol to much in between. And to see how it works, to get all those details, I will direct your attention over to vitamunk.com/BOG2 to like the number BOG, like buy one, get one.
Smart Drug Smarts.
I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Joel Pearson. He's a professor at the University of New South Wales in Australia and the director of the Science of Innovation Lab, where he studies cognitive neuroscience and specifically is interested in the mechanisms and applications of mental imagery, hallucinations, visual perception, metacognition — metacognition is thinking about thinking — and awareness. And to study the conjunction between these areas, he uses behavioral research, brain imaging, and brain stimulation techniques. We will hear a little about TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, and TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, in the coming interview. We've touched on both of those topics before. What will be front and center today is something called aphantasia. And what aphantasia is the lack of an ability to picture something in your mind's eye. Or if you prefer, maybe just the lack of a mind's eye. Obviously, a mind's eye is not a real anatomical thing, but just a concept that we use. Sort of a vocabulary shorthand for that ability to call an image to mind in your imagination. And up until recently, it had been assumed that everybody could do this. Maybe some people could do it better than others. People that have really high levels of visual recall might be on the high end of a spectrum. But to some extent, everybody could do this. At least people that are naturally sighted. For blind people, this might be different. But apparently that thinking just ain't so. There are people who we now call aphantasics who literally cannot call a mental image to mind. And what an interesting and seemingly fundamental piece of our internal mental landscape for there to be such a major difference in the way that people operate. We had an episode, I'm pretty sure it was episode number 123, about theories of consciousness. Consciousness is one of those things it's really difficult to talk about with any sort of specificity because the terms themselves are used so differently by different people. And mental representations are kind of the same ballpark. But one of the really interesting things that Dr. Joel Pearson has done in his lab is come up with a way of quantitatively measuring a person's ability, or maybe not ability, but let's say proclivity, towards visual mental representations of ideas. He'll explain how that works in the coming interview, but picture yourself pulling up a chair, sitting back, and listening in on a conversation with Dr. Joel Pearson.
Aphantasia refers to complete lack of mental imagery or the imagination, and it typically gets used to refer to a visual imagination or visual mental imagery. So you have congenital aphantasics, so they're people that are just born with a blind mind with no imagination. And then you can have acquired aphantasia, so someone may have had a stroke or an accident and lose their ability to imagine things.
And this is just imagining mental pictures, not full spectrum imagination. You could imagine a conversation, you could imagine a story, but you couldn't imagine your mother's face.
Yeah, so it gets used to refer to the sensory nature of things in your mind. So not things that are propositional, semantics, or ideas, but the sensory nature, more when you try and think about how something looks. So what does an apple look like? The majority of people will conjure up a visual image of an apple. And so that's really what people are talking about when they talk about aphantasia and mental imagery.
It's difficult to think what that would be like to lose the ability to have that mental representation. How do people that at one point had the ability to conjure mental images and no longer can, how did they describe that change?
So we're studying a lot of aphantasics in the lab now. We don't have many acquired. So most of them are congenital. They're just born that way and they can never remember having an imagination. We've had one or two that sort of lost it, and they do remember once having the ability to see something in their mind's eye, and now they just can't. What you sort of touch on there brings up this really fascinating nature of studying this topic. So me, I have a pretty good imagination, and so I have really poor intuition trying to figure out what it must be like to think about something without having a sensory imagination. So when I think about a beach or an apple, I can't help but see it in my mind's eye. And the inverse. So if you've never had imagination, it's completely normal. And an aphantasic can't really predict what it would be like to have a visual imagination.
So let me back up there for a second, because that kind of reminds me of color blindness. Like, how did people even realize color blindness was a thing? It's like, if you have a limited color palette that you can see, how do you even realize that other people can see colors you don't like? How did it become clear to us that visual imagination is lacking in some people?
Yeah, so we've known for a long time that there's a variation of imagery strength or imagery vividness across the general population. But it really wasn't until, about 2 years ago, this phrase aphantasia came into the lexicon. And there was a paper published which talks about it. And then a journalist for the New York Times wrote a piece about it. And then it kind of went crazy. It sort of hit multiple newspapers, multiple blog sites. And then once people started reading about it, we had this amazing phenomenon where I was getting, an email every day, and lots of my colleagues in this area were, and people were just shocked. And lots of emails would say things like, wait a sec, people can actually see something in their mind's eye. And so aphantasics had never realized they didn't have an imagination. They'd lived some of them 60 years of life without ever realizing that they don't have an imagination, or to put it another way, without realizing that other people do have a sensory imagination. They say things like, when my friend said I can see it in my mind, they thought that was a metaphor. They didn't think it was literally seeing something in their mind's eye. And so a lot of them are really, really shocked to realize that people can see something in their mind. And there's been a lot of nice articles written by first-hand aphantasics talking about this sort of shock and what must it be like to see something at will in your mind's eye.
Could one of these people, could they doodle a picture? If you say, draw a picture of an apple, what happens?
Yes, someone without imagery can do pretty much everything someone with imagery can do. There are a few exceptions, so we've been testing them in a whole bunch of ways. And there doesn't seem to be that much difference. So if you ask them to do what's called a visual working memory task, they can still perform these tasks. But when you start probing how they're doing it, they do it in a very different way. So maybe they use numbers, algorithms, geometry, spatial locations to remember visual information, whereas someone like me would remember that information using mental imagery. So they get the same or similar performance, but they use a completely different brain mechanism and they do something different in their mind. You want to think about it like that.
Maybe if we can try to make that concrete, how would that work in the case of the draw me an apple example?
So different aphantasics will do it in different ways. So some have described, when you ask them to do something like that, they'll say, I bring up the idea of an apple, the semantics, what the flavor, everything about my childhood memories about an apple, and then they'll draw the apple. Someone else would say, when I try and remember an apple, if I want to draw it, I'll bring up the tactile sensation. So maybe they can imagine touching it, but they can't imagine seeing it.
Wow.
And so there's quite a big individual difference there that people will do it in different ways. What we think's happened is that people have developed different kinds of mechanisms to compensate for not having an imagination, but still being able to draw an apple, still being able to figure out, remember where they parked the car and navigate back through the car park. All the kind of things that you might think people use their imagination or use mental imagery for, aphantasics have developed different ways of compensating for that lack. So there's not just one answer to that question. It really depends on each individual and how they've done that.
Based on the people that have come forward and said, hey, I'm like this, are there any correlations with anything else that might be interesting?
Yeah, so it's still pretty early days in terms of research. We haven't seen anything obvious in terms of, entrepreneur, artists. No sort of careers seem to correlate with aphantasia. So we see there are some famous entrepreneurs, famous scientists, all that are aphantasic. So nothing like that. We are looking down some other avenues with sort of the emotional response to things. So one of the things we know a lot about in psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience is anxiety disorders, PTSD. Mental imagery plays a large role in those mental disorders. So one hypothesis we're working on is if you don't have strong imagery, then maybe you're somewhat immune to getting PTSD.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting silver lining, right? So I don't know the answer to that. So we have an ongoing experiment looking at that at the moment. But we know that imagery plays a role in maintaining these sort of traumatic flashbacks. So often the memories will come in the form of a strong visual image. And so if you don't have that ability, it makes sense that the way PTSD works is going to be different.
How do these people describe their dreams?
So that's interesting. Most of them pretty much all describe having fairly normal visual dreams. So they still dream. Some have described having visual hallucinations when they take different drugs. So that seems pretty normal. So there seems that there might be a split between the sort of voluntary and involuntary side of seeing things in the mind. So when it's automatic, things seem normal. When it's voluntary, when they try and imagine something, it doesn't seem to be there.
It makes you wish you could do experiments on young children to see at what point these people kind of veer off. It seems like actively encouraging young kids to imagine things and like looking at storybooks and having these images sort of dovetail into the narrative of the characters. That's something it's such an integral part of the first couple of years of life learning. It'd just be interesting to know where aphantasics sort of go off the tracks that most people continue to follow.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'd love to set up a developmental study looking at sort of as young as possible children to see if aphantasia is clear early on or when it first becomes noticeable or measurable.
How many people have raised their hands and said, hey, this applies to me? I mean, does this seem like it's just a really small sliver of the population, or what are we talking here?
So more and more are realizing every day, but it looks like maybe 4, 5, 6% of the population at the moment.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot higher than I thought you were going to say. That's halfway to being as prevalent as left-handers.
Yeah, so it's quite a few, yeah. And then there's all different categories, right? There's just visual, which most people will talk and write about visual aphantasia. But then you have all the other senses and whether you can imagine the sound, taste, touch, all those kinds of things. And we have some individuals which describe not being able to imagine any of the senses, and other people that just have pure sort of visual aphantasia.
Does one seem to be more common than the other based on what you've seen?
So far, yeah, visual, but I'm not sure whether that's because of the way the media has been reporting it. So lots of people are coming forward and reaching out to us.
I'm sort of going through all the senses in my head now. I'm trying to think, like, could I really imagine how something smells?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this. So I travel a bit, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, it's very hot here. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and it's very hot here. But if I travel to the US where it's cold in winter, I have to pack differently. I have to pack very warm clothes. And I'm often really bad at that. So when I try and predict and imagine being a cold climate, I'm pretty poor at doing that. So I was trying to think maybe the closest I can get to experiencing some kind of aphantasia is to try and imagine temperature. Because I don't seem to be very good at that. So maybe I'm slightly aphantasic when it comes to imagining temperature.
Yeah, you can really subdivide it very specifically. It's like I remember they would always talk about the 5 primary senses. And when I was a kid, I was like, okay, we got 5 senses. That's the end of it. But when you kind of think about it, there are all these lesser senses like sense of temperature or sense of like, is my tummy hungry? Things like that they don't really fit cleanly into any of the primary 5.
Yeah.
So it sounds like if this is a relatively new subdivision of humanity, there's so many different studies that a person might want to do.
Yeah.
What are you most curious about next?
We've just published our first study where we went beyond subjective self-report. So we used some technology we developed in the lab previously where we use a visual illusion called binocular rivalry, and we use that to measure the sensory strength of someone's imagination, so their visual imagery. So we use this more objective technique in the lab to show that it wasn't just subjective self-report, that aphantasics really don't have visual imagery. So that was the first step in sort of taking aphantasic research into the lab.
Can you explain that study a bit?
So binocular rivalry, it's a really cool visual illusion. It's a bit like a lot of the listeners may have seen this illusion that went around the internet with this rotating dancer. So this naked silhouette, it spins around and you look at it and it spins leftwards and it flips around and spins to the right and then the left. And that's a class of illusion called bistable. So you see it going one way, and then all of a sudden it flips and goes the other way. And there's all kinds of illusions like this, like the simple silhouette faces or the vase or the vase in the middle. Again, that's bistable. So things that you can see in 2 different ways. So binocular rivalry is in that class of visual illusion. And a few years ago, we figured out a way to harness that as just simply a tool to measure visual imagery. So we can use this binocular rivalry illusion to measure the strength of an individual's mental imagery. We present, let's say, a red pattern to one eye and a green pattern to the other eye. And that's why it's called binocular rivalry. Those patterns are literally fighting it out in your brain for perceptual or consciousness dominance, right? So if you look at binocular rivalry continuously, you'll see the red pattern, and all of a sudden you'll see the green pattern, and those two patterns will just oscillate or vacillate back and forward over time. It's a really cool illusion, and it gets used to study consciousness in all kinds of interesting ways. So what we discovered a while back is that you get someone to imagine the green pattern, to say for a few seconds, then they stop, and all you do is just flash on this binocular rivalry illusion just for like a second and turn it off. And then the person reports, which pattern did you see, the red or the green? They tend to see the pattern that they'd previously imagined, right? So it's kind of like a priming effect. There's this bias. I imagine green, I tend to see green. I imagine the red pattern, I tend to see the red. And so through this bias or this priming thing, we can actually measure the imagination or visual imagery, and we don't have to ask people about their visual imagery. We don't have to use questionnaires or anything like that. And that was a big step forward in studying the mechanisms of imagery in the lab, because we didn't need to rely on questionnaires anymore.
So with people that are aphantasics visually, it would have been like 50-50. They could have gone either way.
Yeah, exactly. So we tell them to try and imagine the red pattern. They do the best they can, and there's no influence on the binocular rivalry illusion. So they get no priming, so it's kind of like nothing. So it fits really well that they actually don't have a visual imagination. So what we're doing now, we've been studying, just in the normal population, we've been studying for a while now, what is the difference in the brain mechanisms of someone with strong or weak imagery. So we've found a couple of things. One is the size of visual cortex. Quite literally, people with, and this is kind of surprising, smaller visual cortex have stronger imagery.
Not what you'd expect.
Yeah. So we've published that paper, and now we're trying to use brain stimulation, so both transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and also TDCS, using a very weak electrical current to try and control someone's imagery strength. We've done that in the normal population. We haven't published that yet, and it seems to work. We seem to be able to slightly up or down regulate someone's imagery by stimulating either visual cortex or frontal cortex. And then the big question that I get asked from aphantasics is, can we give them an experience of mental imagery? So can we use brain stimulation of some form and training, or maybe both together, to try and give people imagery? So at the moment, we're planning a large study where we're going to combine like a training regime plus some brain stimulation to try and give people imagery.
On the face of that just sounds like it would be very difficult. Like strengthening your muscles isn't going to help you ride a bicycle if you don't actually know how to ride a bicycle. Like just giving you stronger leg muscles or a better sense of balance doesn't mean that you have the various other skills involved with that. It just seems like making the visual cortex have more energy available to it wouldn't necessarily help you with that very specific task of imagining visual images if you hadn't kind of primed your brain to know what to do there.
Exactly. So the way we're doing, what we're trying first up in terms of the training is, rather than say someone looking at a blank black screen and saying, imagine an apple. We put something on the screen and we try and say, you can see the apple. Now try and imagine the apple just moving a little bit to the left. So it's working with something that's already there. So there's already activity in visual cortex. They're already seeing something. And it's the idea of trying to manipulate that rather than create a mental image from scratch. And you're right, it may be that there's something fundamentally different about the visual cortex of an aphantasic and this won't work, but I think we need to try.
Is this something like my daughter can wiggle her ears? That's kind of cool, but I mean, it's probably not really going to help her survive or breed or anything better than people that can't wiggle their ears. I don't think there's much selection pressure for it, and those of us who can't wiggle our ears are getting along just fine. Other than just sort of the interestingness of this being a thing, like, does it matter? Do these people seem like they suffer any real-world consequences from not being able to visualize things?
So far, no. That's kind of important because a lot of people write to me saying, I have this disability. This is the reason my career hasn't progressed. They see it like a disease, all this negative stuff. And so far, it's not like that. So most people, like I said, find a way to compensate and use a different brain mechanism to achieve the same goal. So they do it differently, which means the information in their brain is going to be different, but they're still doing it. I think of this like synesthesia, where it's not necessarily a negative, it's just a difference. And it's not a disability. It may even be a silver lining, right? So we don't know yet. Maybe these people are immune to anxiety disorders and other things.
Yeah, it seems like it's probably akin to like being left-handed, like you might need a different set of scissors, but it's not an inherent disability.
Yeah. There will be differences, right? So we have data showing mental imagery plays a role in all kinds of things, from navigation to perception to when you read, you tend to imagine things, to eyewitness memory. So mental imagery seems to modulate eyewitness memory to a degree. What else? Moral decision making. There's evidence that when you get people to do these trolley cart moral dilemmas, if they have a good imagination, they'll imagine it. And that simulation gives them often a different experience and therefore a different answer. So we know that imagery plays a role in basically anything that involves some kind of predictive simulation. And so if the content of that simulation is different, it's semantics and ideas and not vision or not sensory content, things will be different. So there's no getting around that. Doesn't mean they'll be worse.
It's really interesting to think about the potential consequences on empathy it might have if you're not able to visualize something good or bad happening to somebody. The trolley problem is sort of a great example of that. If you can't imagine the person that you're going to, push in front of the train, maybe it's easier to make the push.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what the data suggests, that if you can't imagine it, it's less consequential. Whether you have this visceral sensory experience of some person you're going to push off the bridge, then you're less likely to do that to save, the other 5 people.
I feel like imagination is too broad of a term to use for this.
Yeah.
You can probably imagine, you just can't visually imagine. It's like the narrative is probably independent of the sensory modality.
Yeah, so that's why I try and say mental imagery or visual mental imagery to try and be clearer. So I like saying the imagination. People often think I'm talking about creativity and ideas and all this other stuff.
Who came up with the term aphantasia?
So a friend of mine called Adam Zeman in the UK, he's a neurologist, and he was studying a single patient, I think, when he first came up with that phrase. So like Aphantasia from fantasy, and A meaning not having fantasy, so just not having imagery. There's also the opposite. There's hyperphantasia or hyperphantasic. So someone that has very strong, crystal clear, like photographic imagery. And we have a few of those individuals, but they're not as common as aphantasics.
I think it would be just fascinating to look at the type of early childhood learning that people did that wound up as aphantasics, if there's a difference there. Just intuitively, it seems to me like conjuring up images in your mind is a skill that we probably learn really, really early on.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I mean, at this stage, we just don't know, so I can't give any information on that. But we'll add it to the list. We've got this database of aphantasics. I've got this long list of experiments. We're just trying to get in there and look at, childhood memories, episodic memory, like all the memory stuff is a big thing. So if I think back to childhood memories of summer holidays or whatever, and I can't have the sensory simulation of that, is my memory somehow deficient, or is it less emotional, or how is it different without that sensory component? That's a big question. With hallucinations, involuntary imagery, PTSD, how do they all map together? Are they different things? Are they similar? And we don't know the answer to that either.
How does it work when people are reading a novel or something like that, where for most people, it's like when you're reading a story or somebody's telling you a story, you kind of do get pictures coming to mind and you can imagine like rooms that you've never seen. How do these people describe situations like that? It's like if they can dream and they're seeing images in their dreams, it's different though if they're reading a book?
It seems to be, yeah. So a lot of aphantasics described not having that sort of simulation experience while they're reading. Does that mean they read less or they get less into novels? We don't know the answer to that. So there's some interesting discussions. There's a bunch of different aphantasia discussion groups on Facebook and on different things. And there's big discussions about that. We haven't got any sort of clear data on that to know. But there is evidence that when people read, they use visual imagery to help experience the narrative. So I think there has to be some kind of difference.
This is super interesting, even from just a pure science, knowledge for the sake of knowledge perspective. But is there therapeutic applications here that jump out at you?
A couple of things. Probably the most urgent is PTSD, like I mentioned earlier, and anxiety disorders are probably the most common mental health problem. And we know that imagery plays a huge symptom, and also it's a bit more than a symptom. It kind of drives the disorder. And so we think that aphantasics might sort of provide a unique opportunity to study anxiety without imagery. And because we don't really understand the mechanisms of imagery, the mechanisms of anxiety disorders, not a lot is known about that. So aphantasics, I think, are the key to understanding imagery in general, and understanding imagery is the key to treating a bunch of mental disorders. Perhaps it's key to maybe boosting creative simulation and things like that. I mean, anything that uses imagery, if we can understand it and control it, will benefit. So I think there are all kinds of potential applications beyond the clinical as well.
How much work has been done using something like QEEG to look at the brain of somebody with a normal visual imagination when they are doing visual imagery, what areas of the brain are lighting up versus somebody with aphantasia? Do we know what those differences look like?
We see a network. So we see everything from activity in the frontal cortex through parietal, right down to the early areas of visual cortex. So there seems to be this network of sort of feedback signals. And that makes sense. If I want to imagine an apple, I first have to remember what an apple is, get the information, and that information has to feed backwards through my brain back to the visual cortex where the image of the apple is, let's say, created. And so there's this sort of feedback signal going backwards in the brain. That requires a whole network. And unfortunately, we haven't done those studies with aphantasics yet to see what kind of differences there are. There could be a difference in the frontal cortex, that feedback signal, where it comes from. It could be a difference in visual cortex. It could be a difference in both those areas. We just don't know yet. The good thing is we now have the method to measure the strength of mental imagery, of visual imagery, reliably, objectively in the lab, so we can do that. That's the first step, right? If you want to understand the brain mechanisms of imagery, first you've got to measure it accurately. So we can do that. So we're now starting to understand the brain mechanisms in a normal population, and now we've just got to sort of take that research into the aphantasic population, which is happening right now.
It's fascinating thinking about these areas where our natural inclination is to assume that the inside contours of somebody else's mind is a lot like the inside contours of our own. There's not really a way, short of asking somebody, to really zero in on that and find out whether that assumption holds or not. Yeah. Even if we do suspect something's different, even correctly articulating what we suspect and making sure that the other person understands and that nothing is getting lost in the translation, that's really quite a challenge.
Yeah, it is. And that's the difficulty in studying this. So me and the researchers in my lab, we all have good imagery. And so we don't know what it's like to be aphantasic, but nonetheless, we're trying to figure out what it is like and measure it. And so it is difficult because we can't intuit from our own experience.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Joel Pearson for taking the time for that conversation. Although there's only the most tangential of connections, this reminds me of, I believe it was 2016, when they discovered that the lymphatic system extends into the brain, a pretty big discovery at the time. I just think it's fascinating that we are still making discoveries that are this big, this consequential. This seems like a big feature that was missing about people's mental lives. While in the midst of doing that interview, I was sort of going through the five senses, thinking about myself. I really think that I personally might be aphantasic when it comes to the senses of smell and taste. I can't honestly say that I can call to mind the smell or a taste of something that it's not actually present. If I have like a leftover taste from the last meal I ate in my mouth, that's one thing. And I can imagine texturally the feel of that thing in my mouth, but I can't really say that I can imagine the flavor, either smell or taste. The moment that it would hit my tongue, I would instantly recognize it, but that's not really the same thing as being able to re-envision it at will. I'm strongly going to double down on my guess that this is a learned skill. This is something that some people pick up when they're little kids, or they don't. But if I'm right about that, if it is a nurture rather than nature thing, it would be really interesting to confirm that, first of all, and then really to do some studies and see how this ability or inability maps onto people's behaviors in the world. This very much sounds like the kind of thing where if you can't do this one particular mental visualization, there's lots of workarounds, but different workarounds have different consequences. Having a bicycle is a workaround for not having a car, but it has a big difference on your maximum speed and maybe your cardiovascular health and certainly your carrying capacity for groceries. So it'd just be interesting to know for the people that are aphantasics and that are finding different cognitive workarounds, where those are working well and where they're not. And maybe if some of those cognitive workaround skills that aphantasic people are using would also be trainable for people that actually can do mental visualization. But as Dr. Pearson said in that interview, these are very early days in this topic. And speaking of catching things early, we will turn our attention to Alzheimer's in the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So Alzheimer's disease, as you know, is one of the world's most feared diseases. It affects over 5 million people in the U.S. and is silently growing, prepping itself to one day show symptoms in countless others. It has a very long ramp-up period, and it's actually the 6th leading cause of death in the U.S., and it stakes its claim on a person's brain slowly, building up over 20 to 30 years before it actually has behavioral consequences. One of the telltale signs now for oncoming Alzheimer's is the buildup of something called amyloid beta plaques. Amyloid beta is a type of protein. There's also a protein called tau, which is involved. But abnormal levels of these proteins start decades early before there's actual symptoms. And up until now, it's been both difficult and costly to actually see when this process starts. This could be with brain scans or spinal fluid extractions, neither of which are something that's done casually. But in research recently published in Nature and conducted by scientists from the University of Melbourne, they found a blood test that's able to accurately predict the buildup of amyloid beta in more than 90% of cases. The study involved 373 Australian and Japanese subjects. Researcher Koichi Tanaka explains, "From a tiny blood sample, our method can measure several amyloid-related proteins, even though their concentration is extremely low. We found that the ratio of these proteins was an accurate surrogate for the brain's amyloid burden." While researchers still don't understand exactly how Alzheimer's begins or develops, everyone agrees that having early warning, especially decades of early warning, is certainly a good thing, and could conceivably allow people to implement lifestyle changes which will slow the oncoming Alzheimer's or perhaps stop it entirely. And of course, if you've got decades of time, there's always the hope for new treatments to be developed during that time. Says the lead researcher Colin Masters, "I can see in the future, 5 years from now, where people have a regular checkup to determine whether they're on an Alzheimer's pathway or not. This new test has the potential to disrupt the expensive and invasive scanning and spinal fluid technologies. In the immediate short term, the most likely foreseen use of this test is actually going to be to identify people for Alzheimer's studies, getting groups of people identified that are likely to be on the road towards Alzheimer's, so then they can try different therapeutic and preventative techniques to see which of those work."
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, so that was it for episode number 219. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/219. If you missed last week's episode, the Valentine's edition, we spoke with Dr. Larry Young about oxytocin. If you find humans interesting, oxytocin has got a lot to do with that. And next week, got a great episode coming up talking about human cognitive pitfalls, things that our brain just can't seem to get right, but at least we reliably do them in incorrect ways, which actually gives us some ways to build bumper rails for ourselves, help our brains work better than they otherwise might. That'll be next week, so come back for that. I will see you back here then. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.